Thank you very much for the opportunity. If you just bear with me while I bring my slides up. Well, this is looking at recurrent memes and technological fallacies, and particularly looking at the brief we've got here is looking at artificial intelligence and the future of work. Now, this is joint work that I've done with Dave Heatley from Sawtooth Economics in Wellington, New Zealand. Dave is actually the lead researcher on this project, and I've come along for the ride working with him. Dave used to be one of my staff when I was at the New Zealand Institute for the Study of Competition and Regulation, and he's sort of the practitioner half of the practitioner and academic duo that we've done with a lot of writing. And he was formerly with the New Zealand Productivity Commission, and this work has been built on and goes beyond work that Dave did when he was working at the New Zealand Productivity Commission. And the Productivity Commission report is there, which these slides, presumably, Mokyr, they'll be available for people if they want to use them afterwards. So the link is there to the Productivity Commission work, which does a lot more in depth of particular industries than I'm going to talk about tonight. The particular work tonight is a book chapter that's going to appear in a forthcoming handbook on AI and work from Edward Elgar. So our brief for this was particularly to look at the memes that have become popular around artificial intelligence and the future of work. We've looked at these because these memes or myths have become quite formative in the development of policies, and we need to explore for the policy applications where the government should be responding to the concerns that come out of projections of what might happen as artificial intelligence becomes more developed or more widespread in use. From this, we developed some hypotheses, because if in fact, or to just take one step back, if in fact we were starting to see some effects from artificial intelligence, and by this we mean the use of big data and mathematical modelling using big data to create algorithms aid in decision-making in a work-based or policy-based environment. If in fact the changes that were being brought in labour markets from the application of a growing amount of AI out there, then we would expect to start to see that appearing in the normal economic indicators, or we'd start to see some evidence already that we were seeing these effects passing through. So going to the past, given that when we make projections, we are using the past to guide those projections, we thought that the first step would be to see whether there was any evidence that we could see so far of these memes being come into fruition in the economic data. And as you'll see tonight, we couldn't find a lot of evidence for that. So we thought that people just don't think up of these great ideas without some sort of foundation. And with most memes, there is some sort of logic that might sit in behind it, albeit flawed. So we stepped back and thought, well, what particular flawed reasoning or fallacies could be leading people to believe that there were going to be these drastic effects from the growth of AI, and why have they become so persistent? Because policy is not just about responding to the empirical data and the research, it's also about looking at how one can shape the conversation or redirect the conversation to one that is more in keeping with what's going to work, what's going to apply when one tries to put policies into action. So we wanted to look also for what some of the implications for government policy might be. We touch on that only a little in this paper. There's a lot more of that in the Productivity Commission report. What Dave and I have made different in this piece of work are the exploration of the fallacies and why the memes are so persistent. The testing of the hypotheses and the implications for government policy, to some extent, are carried through in the Productivity Commission report. And because we've brought a multidisciplinary approach to this, we're not going to just rely on the economic arguments. We want to try and look at some of the behavioural aspects and the way people think and make decisions to see if that provides some explanations as to why we're seeing the reactions that we see when, by our take of looking at the evidence, these seem to be perhaps a little premature or a bit of an overreaction. So what are the memes? Well, the classic meme and the belief that we've been addressing is that technological change is accelerating, and particularly the rate of technological change associated with AI is accelerating, and AI is now everywhere, and that is going to have some fundamental and devastating effects on labour markets. And in this dystopian future of work scenario, the robots and the computers are coming to take our jobs. Of course, we see that in the academic world, where the suggestions are that artificial intelligence or computer-based models will do away with teaching in the classroom. And it seems as though, despite the fact that the technologies assist, we're not necessarily seeing it replaced. It's changing the way we do the work. But so far in this COVID world, I don't see that the ability to use computer-mediated instruction is necessarily going to get rid of the sort of teaching we do for research-led teaching in an academic environment. So we can see now that some of these prognostications about the devastating effects could be overstated. What we do see, though, is that once one of these beliefs becomes entrenched and turns into a meme, the forecasts that come from these suggestions that the robots are taking our jobs tend to morph into facts. And as a consequence of that, we do start to see policymakers responding to the beliefs rather than the facts. And I think that's, in fact, what we are seeing. So just being clear about what we mean by memes. We mean ideas, behaviours or styles. They're spread by imitation from person to person within a culture. They are sociological artefacts. They often carry symbolic meaning and representing specific phenomena or themes. They appear to have some logical foundation, and they take a considerable effort to refute because of the artifice of logic that appears to underpin them. But when one starts to unpack what is in the meme, one starts to see that critical reasoning causes some skeptical takes on what has been assumed in the first place, looking to question some of the foundations of those beliefs. And by doing that, by applying that critical thinking, rather than just responding to an appealing narrative, we can get a better understanding of that. And that's why we say just because the narrative's appealing and it makes a nice soundbite, it doesn't make the meme correct. And therefore, it shouldn't be axiomatic that policymakers should be expected to respond to memes. In a good policy context, we would expect the policymakers to respond to the logic, not the meme. But unfortunately, we do see the risk that the policy is responding to the meme instead. The future of work meme is not new. I suspect possibly, the first little stone cutting device was applied back in the Stone Age. There was some suggestion that possibly those people who whacked the stones hard to break them apart were going to be without a job. The reality is the future of work is not a new meme. Even within the 20th century, we've seen many repetitions of the fact that technological change is going to do away with jobs because, as Keynes said, we're going to get so good at using technology that we'll create technological unemployment, and that will lead to mass unemployment because we won't have anything left to do with the time that we would have otherwise done in carrying out the tasks that have now been replaced by the technology. Herbert Simon even, and what we're seeing here is even reputable scholars in the period of time who have been working with the technologies themselves, also suggested that machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work man can do. Kennedy, technological change is occurring at breathtaking pace, and at such pace that cannot create new ills as it dispels the old, new ignorance, new problems, new dangers. And more recently, it was very evident that some sections of the community were seriously concerned at the likely impacts of microprocessors and new technologies on employment opportunities, and arguably even to the control of the economy itself. So the meme about the computers taking our jobs is not new. The meme of technology causing change that will disrupt the workplace environment is not new. But if we're to go back into the history of looking at some of these things, if the computers have been here to take our jobs since the 1950s, then we'd probably see some evidence in the data that they were succeeding in doing that. And a logical, critical thinker would look to examine that record to see if there was any evidence of it. But unfortunately, the response has been that even quite reputable scholars have jumped on the bandwagon and suggested that we are now going to face one of these dystopian futures. From Brynjolfsson and McAfee, digital technologies change rapidly, but organisational skills aren't keeping pace. As a result, millions of people are being left behind. Their incomes and jobs are being destroyed, leaving them worse off. And Furman, accelerating progress in AI could lead to sustained periods of time with a large fraction of people not working and to a fall in both the labour force participation rate and the employment rate. Now, these might follow logically from some starting assumptions, but it begs the question of whether those starting assumptions are in fact correct. Unfortunately, though, we've seen that some people have tried to translate these into the extent of the dystopian effect we can expect to see. So Frey and Osborne probably started the cascade of these memes in 2013 when they suggested that 47% of jobs in the United States would disappear within the next 30 years. It's not just a United States phenomenon. We found there that there were reports from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, ASEAN countries, OECD, and the usual consultants have got in there, PricewaterhouseCoopers, McKinsey, all of these, all suggesting that there's going to be an effect on the number of jobs that will disappear as a consequence of these new technologies. And this is suggesting that there will be a once in a lifetime disruption of labour markets that will be so disconcerting and disruptive that it will change the entire face of employment, just as Keynes had predicted back in the 1930s. So the view that the Productivity Commission, which I had some input into, took in looking at this, was to see whether we could test the hypothesis that what we have seen in the past with the development of new technologies, and in particular, what we've learned over the 70-odd years that we've had computers around, where is the evidence that computers are taking jobs? Now, we're not disputing that there mightn't be some localised effects that occur in particular marketplaces with the development of particular applications. But if we're going to look at that at the general systemic effect, that if we take AI as a transformative technology in its own right, then if that itself was actually totally transforming the foundations of the economy, rather than just having marginal effects in specific industries, then we would expect to see some evidence of these transformations coming up in the economic data. And because AI or computing and the use of these things has been around for such a long time, we would have expected to see it building up over time, so that the effects of this, as computers got more sophisticated, more developed, and the pace of change grew faster, that these effects would be getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we'd be seeing exponential growth rate of the disruptions occurring. So it's very difficult to test this because there aren't good indicators, but we thought that we could take some proxies to help us with this. Now, if we think about Frey and Osborne's predictions, that if we thought about their horizon that they put up, we're 90% of the way to their near-end prediction of 2023, and more than a third of the way to their far-end prediction of 2033. So if there was going to be that transformative change, we should be seeing it now. And the places that we look for evidence is there really a change in the pace of technological change? And where can we see any evidence of the labour market effects of this change? So in the rate of technological change, we decided that it's very difficult to measure this, but we would look at case studies like driverless vehicles. And as an example of this, we've seen huge predictions that driverless vehicles are going to totally transform the transportation and logistics industries. And that this prediction was made by Frey and Osborne, that driverless vehicles, they expected to be one of the first of these technologies to be disruptive, and that most drivers would be actually redundant by now because driverless vehicles would have taken over. And even Elon Musk was suggesting as most recently as 2019 that anyone with a Tesla full self-driving vehicle will be able to make a cross-country automated drive in it by 2020. Now, these predictions just clearly haven't come to pass. You could take the same approach with a whole number of other technologies where these prognostications were made on what would happen to the labour markets, and they haven't happened. Just today, I saw one that suggested that Amazon promised in 2016 that by last year they would be delivering packages by drones all over the world. And their latest test that was only a few days ago resulted in the drone crash landing into a field and catching on fire and needing the local fire brigade to come and put it out. So these predictions have been made that the technology is going to do this, and practically none of them have come to pass. From my own experience, I looked a little while ago at looking at the growth of video conferencing, and the first suggestions of video conferencing being a live tool were made as early as the 1920s. Yet it's taken a full century later for it to become a routine, everyday use tool. It's not that these things don't happen, they just happen to a different time frame, and they don't always happen in a way that's disruptive. They can, in fact, be complementary. And going back to the autonomous vehicles, when one takes a more critical view on this, the evidence just isn't there that these particular technologies are revolutionising the world. There's a clear downward shift right across the forecast period. And at most, this projection from Australia is that 1% of the vehicle fleet will be capable of operating without a driver by 2031. Now, these could be just forecasts, but to the extent that the memes have taken over in the world of AI and the robots are coming to take our jobs, when pushed to the test, it's difficult to find examples like this when we look at the high-profile technologies to find ones that have actually, in fact, led to fundamental change in employment in the sector. Certainly it's not about making people redundant or taking jobs away. In fact, the evidence we've seen is something a little different. I'll come to that shortly. If AI was going to be so good, has it hit the wall? Many arguments have been put up. These are exactly the same sorts of arguments that we saw right the way back in the 1980s when Solow identified the productivity paradox about computing. Progress has not been even, and it may well be that AI will change things, but it may not be in the time horizon we're looking at. That it may happen, it's coming, but not yet. But that has to be expected. When we've looked at all transformational technologies, we have seen that they haven't been immediately transformative just immediately after their rapid growth. It takes a lot of time to bed them in and find out how to use them. And it's not necessarily the case that even when they are embedded, that they actually reduce jobs. The Luddites will be quite surprised to find that there are far more people employed in the cotton industry now with all the machines than there ever were back in the days when they tried to club the machines to bits. We know that AI models are an improvement. What do they actually do? Well, we know that the data-driven AI models are better than human-mediated models, but the evidence to date is they're better, but not by much. They still rely on a lot of human judgment in their creation and to do the modelling and the specification. To the extent that the AI models are better, they're not subject to the human biases that could be confounding. But it's not at all clear that that they're going to be doing well in an environment where we have unexpected outcomes that weren't in fact included in the models in the first place, which ironically are all the same uncertainties that make it difficult to do good forecasting. So the improvements that might come from the use of these models may be incremental rather than transformational. And to the extent that they still rely on human judgment, well, they're still going to need human input to calibrate them. Perhaps more interestingly, we see the fact that these new technologies bring up some new moral dilemmas, that in fact it might not be the technology that's the block at all, but the things like the trolley problem and the ethical issues of how they're employed that are holding them back. And this at least is causing some delays in the autonomous vehicle world, because it's been seen that because humans are actually the recipients of the technologies, different humans will apply different standards in different jurisdictions to what they would expect with the resolution of particular moral dilemmas. And with the trolley problem, it's been demonstrated that even in adjacent counties in the United States, one can get different responses as to how the different communities would actually want the autonomous car to respond to the trolley problem of deviating to kill a child, or a group of people, a large deviation to kill its occupants versus an external person, or a number of adults rather than children. And those views, if we cannot even get a view for the humans that are going to judge the performance of this technology, it's going to be very difficult to actually get the technologies to actually overcome that next step. So maybe the problems there, the technology may have capabilities, but the human limitations are still there, and we're not going to see this ubiquity until those aspects are addressed. And I realise now I'm rabbiting on and taking far too much time talking to these slides, so I better get a speed up. So if we were seeing AI managing to accelerate and take over the jobs world, we'd expect to see productivity growth to go up over time, because the machines would do things more efficiently, so therefore they would take over from humans. In fact, over the time that's been looked at here across all of these jurisdictions, in fact, we see the total opposite. This could be a productivity measurement issue, but I think that that's only part of the story. If there was any indication that we were going to see massive productivity growth out of these models that would displace humans, then the patterns we'd expect to see in the economic data would be totally opposite. And the same with total factor productivity. There's no evidence there that over the time that AI has been supposedly accelerating and taking over, that we're actually making productivity gains out of these things. If we were going to see the labour market effects, we'd expect to see high frictional unemployment, times between jobs increasing, high rates of occupational churn, high exit rates for older workers, shifting boundaries between firms, and shorter average job tenure. When we put that to the test, this is across Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere. In fact, we see the total opposite in these as well. We see low unemployment, high participation rates. Occupational churn across a number of countries in recent decades has been lower than it's been for years. Older workforce participation is increasing faster than it has for a long time, particularly in the last 2 decades. The proportion of temporary and casual work has not grown faster, as we might expect if we had greater insecurity of employment. In fact, in New Zealand anyway, it's been comparatively stable over the past decade. And the average length of job tenure is increasing, and this is from evidence in both Australia and the United States. So none of these things tend to back up the suggestion that the robots are taking our jobs yet. So we go to the fallacies. Why would rational people have bought into some of these myths in the first place? And why do we now see people who we would have thought were intelligent, deep thinkers about these things now responding in a way that would suggest that we should be reacting to the fear that the robots are stealing our jobs? One of the big problems is we have the lump of labour fallacy. And across all of time that we've looked at over the last 200 to 300 years, the assumptions that people have made when buying into the end of jobs as we know it is that they assume that the amount of work that needs to be done and the number of people wanting to do it are inflexible. And this amounts to the assumption that the demands for products and services is inelastic. There's negligible evidence to suggest that in most of the areas where computers have been manifesting their presence, that is the case. The defying example that we looked at in the paper is spreadsheets. we hear that AI and computers are going to be the death of accountancy, that we won't need accountants in the future. Well, that was absolutely a meme that was alive and well in the 1980s when I was in the process of coding general ledger applications in assembler. Spreadsheets have not actually killed the market for accountants. What in fact they've done is actually expanded the market for accountants. The reason is spreadsheets allow more and more complex scenarios to be tested, and because the technology has become more capable now, the number of accountants we've got can now investigate more and more complex scenarios, build more complex models, and they get hired to use the technology to take it to new ends, creating new products and services from those technologies that are highly valued. The same thing that can happen is that quality improvements for the same price can have the same effect. And what we've often seen in particular is what's happened with these technologies is what they've allowed is for a whole number of socially useful or otherwise dangerous or unpleasant jobs that wouldn't be done otherwise can now be economically done with the new technology. And so what's happened is things that were not done before are being done by the technology, and that frees up the accountants and other people to get on with doing more complicated and more intensive work that now allows the better products to be produced. So in fact, the demand for products and services is hugely plastic and grows enormously when these new opportunities present themselves. So despite the memes, I don't think that accountancy is a dead-end profession just yet. And simply because the machines can do a lot more of the calculating and the more predicting, it just means that it frees up the accountants to do more and more complex scenarios, to find more and more complex and difficult things to apply the technology to. The Luddite fallacy, well, that's self-evident. If the Luddites were right, they would have destroyed all the jobs by now, and we'd actually be running around doing nothing in particular. We'd all be idle. So the Luddite fallacy is that if the technology, there's just no evidence for it. The no change to baseline fallacy, this is the assumption that when we see a figure like 47% of US employment will be automated over 10 to 20 years, this doesn't actually mean that half of you will lose your jobs to a machine. If we think about what happens in the dynamic life cycle of employment, we have to think about this in the terms of the average work life. Now, in an average work life of 45 years, the 15 years or so, which is the point of 10 to 20 years that Freya and Osborne's postulated, over that period of time, if we did nothing else anyway, we would expect 33% of the workplace to retire. And if 33% of the workplace will retire, their skills, if they might have been antiquated, will go with them. But at the bottom end, other people will come in to replace them in the workforce, and they'll come in with new skills, new experiences, and they'll be able to pick up the jobs that are related to the new technologies. So it doesn't mean that half the workforce is going to suddenly be redundant. We may see changes in the makeup of the workforce, but if we now put this into context, if we think about that natural movement through the workforce anyway, Freya and Osborne's 47% of jobs lost over 15 years actually becomes a far less scary 14% over 15 years, and that's assuming that the balance of people who stay in the workforce can be trained. So we interpret the statistics in a way that leads to the more pessimistic outcome. But if there's no change, if we actually think differently about how that can be interpreted, it's not even such a scary meme after all. The reality is somewhere in between. It's just a small step from innovation to ubiquity. Is the fallacy that suspects that takes that every new invention that's ever made is going to be an overnight success that is going to take over the world. We know that there's no shortage of cool innovations, and especially there's no shortage of cool innovations that any undergraduate now armed with the right program and the software and whatever can go around and apply data sets to come up with absolutely everything. But it doesn't mean that every one of those models that they come up with is actually going to solve a real problem in the real world. The vast majority of those models are going to be absolute rubbish and they won't change anything. It's just been possible to do it because we've got the technology.
the reality is most things that are invented never come to market because they're never cool enough in the first place, because they don't actually meet a real need. And technological diffusion, even of the ones that are incredibly good, take a long time to come to pass. So things like, just thinking from just off the top of my head at the moment, things like Facebook, how long has it taken Facebook to come from a revolutionary application in a dorm in Harvard in the 1990s to actually become the world-dominating technology that it is now? Well, it took it 20 years to become an overnight success. So if we think about this, even though the technologies are there, and even if they are going to make changes, then the total effect of the change may well be a very long way off, and that gives us time to be able to work through the adjustments. We can predict the future fallacy. This is perhaps giving humans a little bit too much credit for what they might know. We've learned a lot about the world in the times that we've had over our lifetimes, but if we take A.C. Grayling's word for it, the more we know, the less we know actually, really, because the more we learn that there's stuff out there that we don't know about that's even vaster than what we've already learned. So are we actually thinking that we do have the capability to predict the future when we don't? And of course, the only thing we have got to be able to think about what might happen in the future is the past. The problem is we know the past for 100% certainty what actually happened. So if we use that and we're constrained by that with the predicting of the future, then we might not actually be able to identify all the possibilities that might be there. The one that we latch onto may not be the one that actually comes to pass. And because we're human and because we're fallible and there are things that happen that we don't know and are yet to be invented, we lack the knowledge about what those other things are, and they can have fundamental systemic effects on what happens in these markets over time. And that's just with the issue about the technologies we could invent over that time. That doesn't take into account all of the other unknowns that might happen in environmental things, earthquakes, climate change, it's not man-made, all sorts of other things that can influence the path that we take. So to think that we can make projections about what's going to happen with these technologies might actually be a step too far, and that perhaps we should be a little bit more modest in what we can and can't do. So why are the memes so persistent? Memes are so persistent because humans are so fallible in the first place. Humans value losses and gains differently. This has been long known from prospect theory. The framing matters, and the framing for the memes for jobs are always about job losses. No one mentions in this the fact that there could be huge gains that come from these new technologies as well. The focus is on the losses because they weigh more heavily in the human psyche, and we also get bought into the fact that when we respond to a scenario where we see a status quo ante trend of losses, then we will exaggerate the losses to be bigger than they were anyway. So if we're predisposed to losses and we exaggerate, then the natural human effect is to project the losses to be bigger than they are. Of course, on the flip side, we see that the inventors of the technologies themselves are likely to err on the other side. They are latched onto a perhaps flawed status quo ante of increasing prospects. And when they're creating the plans for these new technologies to be developed, they will systematically overestimate the number of gains that can be had. And of course, if one buys into the over-egging of the pudding, one can err equally in that way as well, which probably explains why Musk and Bezos and co were over-optimistic about what the autonomous cars and the drones could do. And we have to remember that when we have a loss that's observed and we get the knowledge of something bad happens, then our position of where we assess ourselves in line of where this comes is relative. So if the first effect we see is a negative one, we reposition our point on the prospect curve to now be lower, and we anticipate the gains, the losses to be bigger as well. So the prospect curve shifts down and down and down, and the scenario becomes bleaker and bleaker and bleaker. And the other tendency to think of relative, not actual positions is we think that, let's say we have a technology that manages to increase the outcomes for all of society, but there's certain segments of society that, even though they're better off after the invention, end up being worse off relative to a group of which they benchmark themselves in society. And we see this with things like life expectancy. Everyone now in the 21st century is orders of magnitude better off with a longer life expectancy than they would have had 120 years ago. There's been some reshaping on the way as to which social groups, are going to actually get the most benefit. But if someone has slipped relatively, then even though their actual outcome is orders of magnitude better, their relative position has slipped, so they feel that they've lost out even though they've gained. So we get that predisposition to pessimisms, and even when the successes are there, we don't necessarily rate them as well as we should. And particularly, we need to be aware of that for interim results, because what we may be seeing with interim results is not actually an absolute decrease in well-being or fortune because of the change, but a relative change compared to somebody else. And reluctance to look beyond first round effects. Labour markets are complex, and they're most certainly not linear. Humans love to look for simple explanations. They want to see simple cause and effect, but that's not the way these labour markets work. They are complex. They are looking into the future, so there is going to be a huge number of uncertainties. And we need to be aware that there isn't a simple answer to this. It's not something that can be translated into a meme. The human tendency is, with everything of this nature, whether it's complex, is to abstract away most of the disconfirming aspects, the things that don't conform to the predetermined narrative. And that leads us to miss some of the things that could be out there to see. So we abstract away, we make the model simple because we want a simple model. That causes us not to go looking for the things we should be looking for, because we framed our model to condition what we're looking for, and we look for the evidence of what we expect to see rather than what actually is what is happening. And this is Kahneman and Tversky's Weizenbaum, or what you see is all there is bias, that we're preconditioned by the meme to look for certain effects, and when we go looking for them, we find them. So we find the evidence of the odd person who lost a job, but we don't actually look and find the evidence of all of those people who got new opportunities as a consequence of the technology. So the policy advice to that is, as Kahneman and Tversky say, is, ask every time one's examining one of these questions, don't fall for the meme and the simple model. Ask what might be missing, because you might have missed the evidence of what was looking to be successful. And memes are easy to repeat, difficult to refute. They are difficult. These are tasks for experts, not something that should be delegated to the Greek chorus or, dare I say it, politicians looking for simple one-liners to get elected. Once a false meme is established, though, it's very difficult to refute it. And the argument that backs this up is John Snow and the miasma theory. John Snow proved in the 1840s in London that cholera was a waterborne disease, and that what was needed to solve the problem was dealing to the plumbing and the drainage around London. The miasma theory was the competing theory of the time, as to which the politicians of the day got their sinecures from, and it was all to do with smells. Now, even though it was known by these people it took them over 20 years after John Snow first established unequivocally that the water system was the source of the cholera problem, the London drainage plans were still working on the theory of miasma, because the false meme of miasma dominated the thinking, and it took a long time for that to change. Similar stories exist about how long it took for things like basic sanitation in maternity wards in hospitals to be adopted. 20 years seems to be the lifetime of a meme, that it can take quite a long time for the false assumptions to be crowded out by the new realities. And, it's sort of thinking about that, those 20 years is, half a working lifetime. And it's because, if you think of, reversion to the mean, half of the old thinkers have now left the workforce and they've been replaced by half with a new way of thinking. That's possibly why it takes that time to be able to get these new ideas through. So memes, easy to repeat, difficult to refute, and motivated supporters and disinterested in objectors also confuse the plot. I won't go into that, it's in the book. So what do we take out of all of this of implications for government policy? Now, there's no neat models for any of this, but if a government was to respond to the Frey and Osborne, the end of driving as a career is new, and that robots would replace the truckers, then an active polity could do things like banning driver training and licensing, offer incentives for early retirement, restrict sales of autonomous trucks in order to work the other way, the Luddite reason. I think if there's one message that can come out of this work for policymakers is that at this stage, given the absence of evidence that we can find that there is any systemic effects coming from the growth of AI, the best thing for governments to do is to do nothing. Do nothing and wait for more information, or even better, commission more research to find out in more detail what is actually going on below the surface. And this is not new, it's not radical, it's always been the best theoretical response to dealing with uncertainty. And had that been done, if a pause had been taken, what we've actually realised by not intervening and not doing anything and sitting to wait to see what happens, what we've now found is that in the American context, at least, there's now massive shortages of truck drivers. So the total opposite is the problem now. And if intervention had been made because of those prognostications, then the supply chains in the COVID times would have been even worse than they've turned out to be. So I think the message is predicting technology is hard. Predicting the changes to labour markets and the effects of technology is even harder. Implementing policy on the basis of flawed predictions is fraught and foolhardy. Trying to get ahead of the game and protecting workers' interests is laudable, but acting on predictions rather than means rather than facts risks harming the interests of those one seeks to protect. So my advice at this stage, and the advice that was given to the New Zealand government from the New Zealand Productivity Commission, is there's no evidence that any systemic intervention is justified at this point as a global response over the entire economy. The caveat is that doesn't mean there mightn't be some isolated instances where there will be change effects happening. But at this stage, it does not appear as though it's having a system-wide economic effect. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention to this presentation and open it up for questions.